In the autumn of 1943, a postman in Berlin held a letter in his trembling hands, a letter that would sentence his neighbor to death. The envelope was thin, almost weightless, but inside it carried the poison of betrayal, a denunciation addressed directly to Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the words chosen to destroy a life with surgical precision. Someone had written that Herr Kaufmann, the elderly tailor who lived on the third floor, had been heard speaking critically of the Führer, that he had hidden forbidden books, that he was a danger to the Reich. The postman knew what happened to people after letters like this arrived at that address. They vanished. They were swallowed by the night, dragged into black cars, and the morning after, their apartment stood empty, their doors sealed with red wax and the stamp of the state. He looked at the letter again, and then he did something that could cost him everything. He walked to the corner of the sorting room, struck a match, and watched the paper curl into ash. This was not the first time, and it would not be the last. Every week, sometimes every day, these letters arrived at the central post office in Berlin, typed or handwritten, anonymous, or signed with the proud flourish of loyal citizens. They accused neighbors of listening to foreign radio broadcasts, of hoarding food, of making jokes about the war, of being Jewish, of having Jewish friends, of thinking wrong thoughts in the privacy of their own homes. The Third Reich had turned Germany into a nation of informants, where trust died and paranoia bloomed like a disease. By 1943, the regime had received over 3 million denunciations, 3 million acts of betrayal that fed the machinery of terror. The Gestapo did not need to be everywhere because the people had become their eyes and ears. A careless word at the bakery, a complaint at the factory, a joke at the dinner table, any of these could end in a basement cell, in torture, in a cattle car heading east. The system relied on this river of paper, this endless flow of accusations, and the postmen were the ones who carried the poison from hand to hand. But one postman refused to play his part. His name was lost to history, buried in the chaos of the war and the silence that followed, but his actions were not. He was an ordinary man, middle-aged, unremarkable, the kind of person you would pass on the street without a second glance. He wore the grey-green uniform of the Reichspost, the swastika armband on his left sleeve, the cap pulled low over his eyes. He delivered letters 6 days a week, walking the same routes through the same neighborhoods, up the same staircases, knocking on the same doors. He knew everyone. He knew the widow on the second floor who saved her ration stamps for her grandchildren. He knew the professor who had lost his position at the university for refusing to join the party. He knew the young mother whose husband had not written from the Eastern Front in 8 months. These were his people, and he watched as the war devoured them, not just from bombs and bullets, but from each other. The turning point came on a winter morning in 1942 when he delivered a letter to an apartment and found it empty the next day. The family had been taken in the night. The father was a clerk, the mother a piano teacher. The children were 9 and 11 years old. He had delivered their mail for 6 years. He had watched those children grow, and now they were gone. He asked the building superintendent what had happened, and the man whispered that someone had written a letter, that someone had said the father complained about the food shortages, that someone had decided this family was dispensable. The postman went home that night and could not sleep. He kept seeing the children's faces, kept hearing their footsteps on the stairs. The next morning, when he sorted the mail and found another denunciation letter, he did not hesitate. He slipped it into his coat pocket, and at the end of his shift, he burned it in the alley behind the post office. It became a ritual, a secret war fought in silence. He learned to recognize the letters by their weight, by the quality of the paper, by the way they were addressed. Official mail to the Gestapo had a certain formality, a coldness in the typing, and the handwritten ones often reeked of spite, the ink pressed hard into the page. He intercepted them before they reached the internal routing system, before they were stamped and logged and sent on their way to become evidence in some kangaroo trial. He destroyed them carefully, completely, leaving no trace. He never told anyone. He never asked for recognition. He simply did what he believed was right, knowing that if he was caught, he would suffer the same fate as the people he was trying to save. The penalty for sabotaging the Reich's mail system was death, and the penalty for obstructing the Gestapo was worse than death. For 2 years he walked this tightrope between heroism and annihilation. He saved lives he would never meet, prevented arrests he would never witness, and carried the weight of his secret like a stone in his chest. Every morning he put on the uniform of the regime he despised. Every evening he burned the evidence of his resistance. And every night he wondered if tomorrow would be the day they discovered what he had done. This is the story of the postman who refused to deliver betrayal, the man who turned the machinery of terror against itself. One burned letter at a time. This is the story they never wanted you to know. Berlin in 1942 was a city that had learned to live with two faces. On the surface, the Reich still projected strength. The grand boulevard still echoed with military parades. The flag still hung from every building, and the propaganda posters still promised final victory. But beneath that mask, the city was rotting from within. The British bombers had begun their campaign in earnest, and night after night, the air raid sirens wailed like tortured animals, sending people scrambling into basements and bunkers while the sky turned orange with fire. Food was scarce, rationed down to the gram, and even with ration cards the shops often had nothing to sell. Coal for heating was almost impossible to find, and families huddled together in unheated apartments, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, watching their breath fog in the frozen air. The war that Hitler promised would be over in months had dragged into its third year, and the caskets were coming home faster than the propaganda ministry could explain them away. Into this crumbling world, the Nazi regime injected a new kind of poison to maintain control. They could not be everywhere, could not watch every citizen every moment, so they turned the citizens against each other. The Gestapo encouraged denunciations with an almost religious fervor, publishing guidelines in newspapers and on radio broadcasts about what constituted suspicious behavior, speaking ill of the Führer, obviously, listening to the BBC, absolutely, but also smaller things, more insidious things. Complaining about food shortages could be defeatism, questioning military strategy could be undermining morale, even showing kindness to forced laborers or expressing doubt about the war's outcome could mark you as unreliable, as dangerous as someone who needed to be removed. The regime understood that fear was most effective when it came from all directions, when you could not trust your neighbor, your co-worker, even your family. Children were taught in school to report their parents. Wives were encouraged to inform on husbands. The entire social fabric was rewoven with threads of suspicion and dread. The denunciation letters arrived at post offices across the city in a steady, sickening stream. They were written on whatever paper people could find, sometimes on the back of old bills or torn notebook pages, sometimes on expensive stationery that suggested the writer had means and status. Some were anonymous, cowardly things with no return address, just venom spilled onto paper and dropped into a mailbox. Others were signed, even boastful, as if the writer wanted credit for their loyalty to the regime. The postman read them all, at first by accident when an envelope came open, then deliberately needing to know what he was carrying, needing to understand the scale of the betrayal. He read about a woman who reported her sister for crying when her son died on the Russian front, claiming the tears showed insufficient faith in the war effort. He read about a shopkeeper who informed on a customer for asking if there would ever be real coffee again, interpreting the question as criticism of the Reich's supply system. He read about a teenager who turned in his teacher for assigning a book that had been banned 3 years earlier, a book the teacher had forgotten was on the forbidden list. What horrified him most was not the cruelty, though there was plenty of that, but the pettiness. These were not ideological warriors exposing genuine threats to the state. These were small bitter people, settling personal scores, using the Gestapo as a weapon in disputes over property lines, in jealousies over promotions, in ancient family feuds that had nothing to do with politics. A man reported his business rival for invented offenses. A landlord denounced a tenant who was behind on rent. Neighbors who had argued over noise or parking spaces suddenly discovered each other's loyalty was questionable. The regime had given these people a loaded gun and told them it was their patriotic duty to fire it, and they pulled the trigger with enthusiasm. The postman realized he was not just witnessing evil, he was witnessing what evil looked like when it was democratized, when it was made available to everyone, when ordinary spite could wear the uniform of state security. And so he made his decision, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, letter by letter, as the weight of what he was carrying became unbearable. He would not be complicit. He would not be the bridge between petty hatred and state murder. He would not deliver these letters to Prince Albrechtstrasse, would not feed them into the machine that ground people into dust. He would burn them instead, every single one he could intercept, for as long as he could get away with it. He knew the risks. He knew that if the Gestapo discovered what he was doing, they would not just execute him. They would make an example of him, would parade his punishment through the streets as a warning to anyone else who might think about resisting. But he also knew that doing nothing was its own kind of death, a slower death of the soul, and he chose to act. The mechanics of his resistance were deceptively simple, but the execution required nerves of steel and an almost supernatural calm. Every morning, he arrived at the central sorting facility on Oranienburger Strasse at 5:30, before the sun rose, before most of the city stirred from its fitful sleep. The building was massive, a monument to German efficiency, with rows upon rows of wooden sorting cases and canvas bins on wheels, and the air always smelled of paper dust and the cheap ersatz tobacco that the other workers smoked. He collected his leather satchel and his assignment sheet, and then he moved to his section, the rows of mail addressed to government offices, to party headquarters, to the various tentacles of the security apparatus. This was where the denunciation letters lived, mixed in with official correspondence, requisition forms, and the endless bureaucratic paper that kept the Reich functioning. He had perhaps 20 minutes, maybe 30 on a slow day, before supervisors started making their rounds, before the sorting floor filled with workers and eyes, and the possibility of being noticed. He developed a system that was part instinct, part careful observation. The Gestapo letters had patterns. They were almost always addressed to Prince Albrechtstrasse No. 8, the headquarters building, or to one of the district offices scattered throughout the city. The envelopes were often cheap, wartime quality, because most people who wrote denunciations were ordinary citizens without access to premium materials. The handwriting varied wildly, from elegant script to barely literate scrawls, but there was often a tell in the way the address was written, a certain formality, a carefulness that suggested the writer understood the gravity of what they were sending. He learned to spot them in seconds, his fingers moving through the stacks with practiced speed, pulling out the suspicious ones, holding them up to the dim light to see if he could make out words through the paper. When he was certain, when his gut told him this was a letter that would end in someone's destruction, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, the one he had sewn deeper specifically for this purpose. The burning happened in different places, never the same location twice in a row, because routine was how people got caught. Sometimes it was the alley behind the post office, in the shadow of the loading dock, where trash bins overflowed with torn envelopes and discarded packaging. Sometimes it was in the public toilet at the Alexanderplatz station, where he would lock himself in a stall, tear the letters into small pieces, and flush them down in batches. His preferred method, when time and circumstances allowed, was a small iron stove in the basement of his apartment building, a communal space where residents were supposed to dispose of excess paper to save on waste collection. He would descend the stairs with a bundle of letters tucked under newspapers and old circulars, acting like any other tenant doing their civic duty, and he would feed the denunciations into the flames one by one, watching the names and accusations blacken and curl and disappear into smoke. He never kept records, never wrote down who he had saved, because records were evidence, and evidence was a death sentence. The fear was constant, a living thing that coiled in his stomach and never quite let go. Every time a supervisor walked past his sorting station, he felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Every time someone looked at him for too long, he wondered if they suspected, if they had noticed his hands moving just a fraction too quickly, if they had seen him slip an envelope into his coat. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, even among the postal workers, and he had no way of knowing who might be watching, who might be filing their own denunciation letter about the postman who seemed too interested in government mail. He trained himself to show nothing, to keep his face blank and unremarkable, to be the most boring, forgettable person in the room. He never spoke about politics, never complained about the war, never gave anyone a reason to look at him twice. He became a ghost in a grey-green uniform, invisible and essential, the kind of man you relied on but never really saw. But invisibility had its limits, and as the months turned into a year, then longer, he began to understand that he was living on borrowed time. The odds were mathematical and unforgiving. Every letter he intercepted was a roll of the dice. Every day he went to work was another chance for someone to notice, for a routine audit to reveal discrepancies, for one of the people who had written a denunciation to follow up and discover their letter never arrived. He had no illusions about what would happen when the odds finally turned against him. There would be no trial, no chance to explain or defend himself. There would only be the knock on the door in the middle of the night, the black car waiting at the curb, and the basement cells where screams were routine and mercy was a foreign concept. He accepted this as the price of his choice, and he kept burning the letters. The people he saved never knew they had been saved, and that was perhaps the cruelest part of his heroism. They went about their lives completely unaware that a neighbor had tried to destroy them, that a letter full of lies and malice had been written, stamped, and dropped into a mailbox with their name on it. They woke up each morning, went to work, came home, kissed their children goodnight, never knowing that somewhere in the machinery of the Reich, someone had designated them for elimination. The postman would see them on his routes, would hand them their ordinary mail, bills and ration card updates, and letters from sons at the front, and he would carry the knowledge of what he had done like a secret weight. There was Frau Gottlieb on Schönhauser Allee, a widow who gave piano lessons to neighborhood children, who always had a kind word and sometimes, impossibly, a piece of hard candy she had saved from her ration. He had burned a letter that accused her of spreading defeatist rumors, of saying the war was lost, of undermining morale. There was Herr Dietrich, the baker, who somehow kept his shop open despite having almost nothing to bake with, who made sawdust bread that tasted like cardboard but kept people from starving. Someone had reported him for complaining about flour allocations, for suggesting the party officials ate better than ordinary citizens, which was true but also suicidal to say out loud. He developed an almost paternal relationship with these unknowing survivors, checking on them without seeming to check, making sure they were still there, still safe, still breathing. When he delivered mail to their buildings, he would linger an extra moment, listening for sounds of life, for voices or footsteps or the clatter of dishes, anything that confirmed they had survived another day. He learned their routines, knew when Frau Gottlieb gave her lessons, knew when Herr Dietrich opened his shop, knew which lights came on at which hour in which apartments. If someone disappeared, if a door suddenly went unanswered or an apartment stood dark and silent, he would feel it like a punch to the stomach, wondering if he had missed a letter, if another postman had delivered what he had failed to intercept, if his small rebellion had not been enough. Sometimes people did disappear, and he never knew if it was because of a denunciation, or simply because the regime had decided they were inconvenient, or because a bomb had found them, or because they had made the desperate choice to flee. The not knowing was its own torture. But there were small victories, moments that sustained him through the fear and exhaustion. There was the morning he delivered mail to the Goldstein apartment, a Jewish family that had somehow avoided deportation through a combination of paperwork errors and bribes and sheer luck, and he saw the children playing in the hallway, their laughter a defiant sound in a city that had declared them subhuman. He had burned 3 letters about the Goldsteins, 3 separate denunciations from 3 separate neighbors, each one demanding the family be removed, be sent east, be erased. Those children were alive because he had struck matches in an alley. There was the afternoon he encountered Professor Rosen, the academic who had lost his university position, but still lived in his book-filled apartment, still read, still thought dangerous thoughts. Someone had written that the professor possessed banned literature, had named specific titles, had provided enough detail to trigger a raid and an arrest. The postman had burned that letter 6 months earlier, and now here was the professor, alive, walking to the market with his shopping bag, existing in defiance of someone's hatred. These moments were rare and precious, and he hoarded them like the city hoarded food, rationing them out in his memory when the fear became too much, when he lay awake at night wondering if tomorrow would be the day his luck ran out. He never spoke to the people he protected, never hinted at what he had done, because to reveal the secret was to endanger them further, to make them accomplices, to force them to carry the same unbearable knowledge he carried. They had to remain innocent, had to be able to honestly say they knew nothing if the Gestapo ever came asking questions. His heroism required their ignorance, and so he remained silent, a guardian angel who worked in shadows and asked for nothing in return. The war ground on, and the denunciation letters kept coming, an inexhaustible supply of human cruelty and fear transformed into paper and ink. He intercepted what he could, burned what he dared, and lived with the knowledge that for every letter he destroyed, dozens more reached their destination. He was one man with 2 hands and limited hours, fighting against an ocean of betrayal. He could not save everyone, he could not even save most people, but he could save some. And in a world where the machinery of evil ran with industrial efficiency, where millions were being murdered in camps whose names he had only heard whispered, where entire peoples were being erased from existence, saving some felt like the only form of resistance available to him. So he continued day after day, walking his routes, delivering mail, and burning the letters that carried death in their envelopes. By the spring of 1944, the weight of his double life had begun to show in ways he could not entirely hide. He had lost weight, his uniform hanging looser on his frame, his face gaunt and marked by sleepless nights. The other postal workers noticed but said nothing, because everyone looked like that now. Everyone was ground down by the war, by the bombings that came more frequently, by the rations that kept shrinking, by the casualty lists that kept growing. He moved through his days like a machine, automatic and precise, sorting mail at dawn, walking his routes through rubble-strewn streets, intercepting letters when he could, burning them when darkness fell. The routine had become almost meditative, a ritual that gave structure to the chaos, but it was also consuming him from the inside, the constant vigilance, the unending fear, the knowledge that a single mistake would mean his death, and possibly the death of everyone he had tried to protect. He had become what the war demanded of everyone who resisted, a person living on the edge of collapse, held together only by will and desperate purpose. The close calls became more frequent, small moments that could have unraveled everything if luck had not intervened. There was the morning a supervisor appeared beside his sorting station without warning, asking casual questions about processing times and delivery efficiency, and the postman had 3 denunciation letters already tucked in his inside pocket, their corners pressing against his ribs like accusatory fingers. He answered the questions with mechanical politeness, his voice steady despite the terror flooding his veins, and the supervisor eventually moved on, satisfied or perhaps just indifferent. There was the afternoon when a woman stopped him on the street, a well-dressed woman with party pin on her lapel, and asked if he had delivered a certain letter to Gestapo headquarters, a letter she had written weeks ago and never received confirmation about. He told her the mail system was overwhelmed, that letters sometimes took months to reach their destination, that she should write again if it was urgent, and she accepted his lie because bureaucratic incompetence was believable, expected even, in a system drowning in its own paperwork. But the closest call, the one that nearly ended everything, came on a grey morning in April when the air raid sirens began wailing just as he was sorting the government mail. Everyone rushed to the basement shelter, grabbing what they could, moving in the practiced panic of people who had done this hundreds of times. In the chaos, he forgot about the 2 letters in his pocket, forgot to hide them or dispose of them, and when the all-clear sounded an hour later and they returned upstairs, he found a Gestapo officer standing in the sorting room. The man was young, mid-20s perhaps, with the hard eyes and expensive uniform of someone who had risen quickly through the ranks by being ruthless and clever. He was conducting a random inspection, he explained, checking for irregularities in the handling of state correspondence, and he wanted to observe the sorting process. The postman felt the letters burning against his chest, 2 pieces of paper that could end his life, and he forced himself to continue working, to sort mail with steady hands while the officer watched, taking notes in a small leather book. The officer stayed for 45 minutes that felt like 45 hours, walking between the sorting stations, asking questions, examining the routing system, and the entire time the postman waited for the moment when the man would ask him to empty his pockets, would notice the slight bulge in his coat, would reach out and discover the evidence that would condemn him. But the moment never came. The officer finished his inspection, made some final notes and left without incident, apparently satisfied that the postal workers were loyal and efficient servants of the Reich. The postman waited until his shift ended, walked to a public toilet 3 blocks away, and vomited until his stomach was empty, his hands shaking so badly he could barely lock the stall door. He had been seconds away from exposure, from arrest, from everything he feared, and only random chance had saved him. That night, for the first time since he began his campaign of resistance, he seriously considered stopping. The risk was escalating. The Gestapo was paying more attention to the postal system, and his luck could not hold forever. He sat in his unheated apartment, a single candle burning because the electricity was out again, and he thought about what would happen if he simply stopped intercepting the letters, if he let them flow through to their destinations as they were meant to, if he chose survival over heroism. It would be easy, defensible even, a rational choice in an irrational world. No one would blame him. No one would even know he had ever tried. But then he thought about Frau Gottlieb and her piano lessons, about Herr Dietrich and his sawdust bread, about the Goldstein children laughing in the hallway, about all the people who were alive because he had struck matches in dark places. He thought about the alternative, about becoming complicit, about being the bridge that carried hatred to its target, about living with that knowledge for whatever remained of his life. And he realized he could not stop, that stopping would be its own kind of death, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. So he made his decision again, the same decision he made every morning, to continue, to resist, to burn the letters for as long as he could until the war ended, or until they caught him, whichever came first. As 1944 dragged toward its bitter end, Berlin transformed into a landscape of apocalyptic desperation. The Allied bombers came almost every night now, British Lancasters in the darkness, American flying fortresses in daylight, turning entire neighborhoods into mountains of rubble and ash. The postal routes changed weekly, sometimes daily. As streets ceased to exist and buildings collapsed into themselves, and the postman found himself delivering mail to addresses that were now just smoking craters or piles of brick. The population lived in basements and subway tunnels, emerging like moles to search for food and water, before retreating underground again when the sirens screamed. The rationing system had effectively collapsed, and people survived on whatever they could scavenge, trade, or steal. Yet through all this chaos, through the disintegration of the city and the slow-motion death of the Reich, the denunciation letters continued to arrive at the post office, an obscene testament to how deeply the poison had seeped into the national soul. Even as Berlin burned, even as defeat became undeniable, people still found time to betray their neighbors, still believed that informing on someone for hoarding a loaf of bread or expressing doubt about the final victory was their patriotic duty. The nature of the accusations shifted as the situation deteriorated, becoming more desperate, more petty, more divorced from reality. The postman read letters accusing people of defeatism for crying over dead relatives, of hoarding for having an extra potato, of treason for suggesting maybe the war was not going as well as the propaganda claimed. He read a letter from a teenage girl denouncing her own mother for saying she wished the fighting would stop so her husband could come home. He read a letter from a man reporting his elderly neighbor for turning off the Volksempfänger radio during one of Goebbels' speeches, as if forcing people to listen to lies in a burning city made any kind of sense. The disconnect between the crumbling reality and the fervent belief in the system was staggering, terrifying. A mass delusion that persisted even as the evidence of failure surrounded everyone on all sides. These letter writers lived in a fantasy where the Reich would still triumph, where punishing dissent still mattered, where the machinery of terror could still function even as the machine itself fell apart. But the chaos also provided opportunities, gaps in the surveillance, moments when the system's attention was focused elsewhere. The Gestapo was increasingly overwhelmed, dealing with genuine resistance cells, with deserters, with the logistics of continuing the final solution even as the Red Army advanced from the east. Random postal inspections became less frequent, not because the regime cared less about loyalty, but because there were not enough officers to conduct them, not enough resources to maintain the same level of control. The postman realized he could intercept more letters with less risk, could expand his operation, because the mechanisms designed to catch him were breaking down. He began taking greater chances, pocketing not just 2 or 3 letters per shift, but 5, sometimes 7, stuffing them into every available pocket into his satchel between legitimate parcels, even into his boots when necessary. He burned them in larger batches, watching entire handfuls of denunciations turn to ash in the basement stove, feeling something that was not quite joy, but perhaps a grim satisfaction that he was fighting back, that he was using the regime's collapse against itself. He also began to notice patterns in who was writing the letters, and the pattern revealed something profoundly disturbing about human nature under pressure. The most enthusiastic denunciators were not the party faithful or the true believers, but people who had something to hide, something to prove, something to compensate for. They were the ones with suspicious backgrounds, with Jewish grandparents they desperately needed to distance themselves from, with family members who had been arrested for political crimes, with some vulnerability that made them overcompensate by demonstrating their loyalty through betrayal. They attacked others to deflect attention from themselves, creating a smokescreen of false patriotism to hide their own perceived inadequacies. The postman recognized this pattern because he saw it in letter after letter, the same desperate energy, the same over-the-top accusations, the same transparent attempt to prove worthiness by destroying someone else. It was cowardice weaponized, insecurity turned into malice, and it made him hate not just the system that encouraged this behavior, but the weakness in people that made them so willing to embrace it. Yet he also witnessed something else, something that gave him fragments of hope amid the ruins. He saw people helping each other, sharing their last scraps of food, hiding deserters in their attics, lying to the block wardens about who lived where, creating small networks of resistance that operated through nods and whispers and unspoken agreements. He saw a shopkeeper slip extra rations to an elderly woman without marking it in the logbook. He saw neighbors band together to dig survivors out of bombed buildings while the authorities were busy elsewhere. He saw people risk everything to shelter a Jewish family that had somehow survived this long in hiding. These acts were tiny, almost invisible against the backdrop of industrial-scale evil, but they existed, they persisted, and they reminded him that he was not alone, that there were others who refused to participate, who chose humanity over survival, who understood that some things mattered more than staying alive. He never met these people, never coordinated with them, never even acknowledged them, but knowing they existed made his own resistance feel less like madness and more like part of something larger, a silent rebellion scattered across a dying city. The moment that would define everything, the moment when his secret war nearly became public, arrived on a frozen morning in January of 1945. The Red Army was hammering at the gates of the city, their artillery audible as a constant thunder from the east, and everyone knew the end was coming, that it was now measured in weeks, perhaps days, not months or years. The postal service was barely functioning, with half the workers dead or fled or conscripted into the desperate Volkssturm militias being thrown at the advancing Soviets. The postman reported for duty as always, moving through streets where corpses lay frozen in the gutters and buildings burned without anyone bothering to extinguish them, and he arrived at the sorting facility to find it in chaos. A bomb had hit the adjacent building during the night, blowing out windows and collapsing part of the roof, and the surviving workers were trying to sort through mail that had been scattered across the floor, mixed with broken glass and plaster dust, and the detritus of destruction. In the confusion, he saw his opportunity and began collecting denunciation letters with unusual speed, not bothering with his usual caution, stuffing them into his pockets and his satchel, taking more than he had ever taken before, because some instinct told him this might be his last chance. But he was not alone in the chaos, and he was not as invisible as he believed. Another postal worker, a man named Kraus, who had always been too friendly, too interested in other people's business, too eager to demonstrate his loyalty to the regime, had been watching him. Kraus was a true believer, one of the rare ones who still wore his party pin with pride, who still spoke of final victory with conviction that bordered on delusion, who saw conspiracies and betrayal everywhere because the alternative was admitting that everything he had believed in was collapsing. And now Kraus had seen something, had noticed the postman moving through the scattered mail with purpose, had seen him take envelopes and hide them in his coat, and Krause's face transformed with the terrible joy of someone who had finally found the traitor he had been searching for. He crossed the sorting floor with quick, aggressive steps, his voice rising above the ambient noise, demanding to know what the postman was doing, what he was hiding, calling for the supervisor, calling for security, his accusations echoing through the damaged building. The postman felt time compress into a single point of crystalline clarity. He could see every detail with absolute precision, the dust motes floating in the grey morning light, the broken glass crunching under Krause's boots, the faces of other workers turning to watch the confrontation, the supervisor emerging from his office with an expression of annoyance that would soon become something much more dangerous. He had perhaps 5 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether he lived or died, whether his resistance ended in a basement cell or continued for whatever time remained. His hand moved to his pocket, feeling the edges of the letters there, the evidence that would condemn him, and he understood with perfect certainty that if those envelopes were discovered, if they were examined and their contents revealed, there would be no talking his way out, no plausible excuse, no mercy. Krause was already pointing at him, already shouting about theft and sabotage, already painting himself as the vigilant patriot who had caught the traitor in their midst. The postman did the only thing he could do. He ran. He turned and bolted for the loading dock exit, shoving past startled workers, his boots slipping on debris, his breath burning in his lungs, and behind him he heard Krause screaming for someone to stop him, to catch the saboteur, to alert the authorities. He crashed through the loading dock door and into the street, into the frozen morning where smoke from 1,000 fires turned the air brown and thick, and he ran without direction, without plan, driven only by the animal imperative to survive. He ran through streets he had walked for years, past buildings he knew, past people who might have recognized him if they had bothered to look up from their own struggles, and he kept running until his lungs felt like they would burst and his legs threatened to give out beneath him. He finally collapsed in an alley behind a gutted department store, his back against a wall covered in propaganda posters that were now just tattered rags flapping in the wind, and he realized that his old life was over, that he could never return to the post office, never walk his routes again, never continue his secret campaign. But even in that moment of despair, even as he gasped for air and felt the full weight of what he had lost, he reached into his pockets and pulled out the letters, the denunciation letters he had been collecting when Krause spotted him, and he counted them with trembling fingers. 11 letters, 11 lives that might be saved because of what he had just done. 11 accusations that would never reach their destination, 11 neighbors who would never be dragged from their homes, 11 families who would never know how close they had come to destruction. He looked at the envelopes, their addresses written in careful script or angry scrawls, their contents full of spite and lies and fear transformed into weapons, and he made his final decision as a postman. He struck a match, one of the last matches he had, and he burned them one by one in that frozen alley, watching the paper blacken and curl, watching the names and accusations disappear into smoke and ash, and he felt something that might have been peace, or at least the shadow of peace, the knowledge that his last act of resistance had been his largest, that if his war was ending, it was ending with one final victory against the machinery of bet. Rail. The postman became a ghost in his own city, a fugitive in streets he had once walked with the confidence of official purpose. He could not go home, could not return to his apartment, because that would be the first place they would look, and by now Krause would have reported him, would have told the authorities about the theft, about the suspicious behavior, about the postal worker who ran when confronted. Whether the Gestapo would bother pursuing him in the final weeks of the Reich was uncertain, but he could not take that chance, could not gamble that the machinery of terror had become too exhausted to care about one more act of resistance. So he did what thousands of others were doing in the death throes of Berlin. He disappeared into the ruins, into the bombed-out buildings and collapsed subway tunnels, into the spaces between the living city and the dead one, surviving on whatever he could find or steal, sleeping in basements and burned-out shops, moving constantly to stay ahead of the patrols that still tried to maintain some semblance of order, even as the order itself dissolved. Into chaos. The days blurred together, measured not by calendars but by the sound of artillery getting closer, by the smell of smoke and decay that grew thicker, by the diminishing number of places left to hide. He encountered others living in the shadows, deserters from the Wehrmacht who had decided survival mattered more than duty, foreign workers who had escaped from labor camps, Jewish families who had somehow stayed hidden through 6 years of genocide, even a few Gestapo officers who had stripped off their uniforms and were trying to blend into the civilian population before the Russians arrived. The social order had collapsed so completely that the predators and prey now huddled in the same ruins, united only by the shared understanding that the next few weeks would determine who lived and who died. The postman kept to himself, speaking to no one, trusting no one, because even now, even with the Reich in its final agony, there were still true believers who would kill you for a perceived betrayal, still party officials who executed deserters and hung their bodies from lampposts with signs declaring them cowards and traitors. He thought constantly about the letters, about the ones he had burned and the ones he had not been able to intercept, about the calculus of his resistance and whether it had mattered at all. In 2 years of secret warfare, he had destroyed perhaps 300 letters, maybe 400. It was impossible to know exactly because he had never kept count, never dared to create records. 300 or 400 lives potentially saved, 300 or 400 accusations that never reached their destination, 300 or 400 acts of betrayal turned to ash. But how many thousands of letters had he not intercepted, had he watched pass through the system, because he was only one man with limited time and reach? How many people had been arrested and killed because he had not been able to stop the letter with their name on it? The mathematics of resistance were brutal and unforgiving, and he understood that even his best efforts had been a drop of water against an ocean of evil, a gesture that saved Somme, while leaving the majority to their fate. Yet he also understood, in the cold rationality that comes from having nothing left to lose, that the value of resistance was not measured purely in numbers, in lives saved versus lives lost. The value was in the act itself, in the refusal to participate, in the choice to fight back even when the fight seemed hopeless. Every letter he had burned was a rejection of the system, a declaration that he would not be complicit, that some part of him remained human and decent in a world designed to strip those qualities away. The Nazis had built their Reich on the assumption that most people would cooperate, would look the other way, would prioritize their own survival over the suffering of others, and they had been largely correct in that assumption. But he had proven the assumption was not universal, that resistance was possible even for ordinary people, even for a middle-aged postman with no weapons and no organization, even when the cost of resistance was everything you had. On the 21st of April, 1945, he heard the sound he had been waiting for, the sound of Soviet artillery so close that the ground shook with each impact, the sound of street fighting, of small arms fire and shouted commands in Russian, the sound of the Red Army finally entering Berlin. He emerged from the basement where he had been hiding and saw Soviet soldiers moving through the ruins, saw the red flags being raised over captured buildings, saw German soldiers surrendering in groups with their hands raised, saw the swastika banners being torn down and burned in the streets. The war was not over, not quite yet. The fighting would continue for weeks in pockets of resistance, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Reich had fallen. The nightmare was ending. He walked through the chaos of liberation, past Soviet tanks and frightened civilians, and the corpses of SS officers who had chosen suicide over capture, and he felt nothing, no joy, no relief, only a profound emptiness, the exhaustion of someone who had lived on adrenaline and fear for so long that its absence left him hollow. The immediate aftermath of liberation was not the joyous celebration that people later imagined, but a period of desperate survival and settling of scores that was in some ways as dangerous as the war itself. The Soviet soldiers were conquerors, not saviors, and they took what they wanted from a city that had nothing left to give. Buildings were looted, women were assaulted, anyone suspected of being a Nazi functionary was executed on the spot or dragged away to camps in the east from which few would return. The postman kept his head down and his uniform hidden, because wearing any symbol of the Reich, even something as innocuous as a postal worker's jacket, could get you shot or worse. He found temporary shelter in what remained of his old apartment building, which had partially collapsed during a bombing raid, but still had a few habitable rooms, and he discovered that some of his neighbors had survived, including Frau Gottlieb, the piano teacher, who looked at him with eyes that had seen too much but still held a flicker of recognition and something that might have been gratitude, though she could not possibly have known what. He had done for her. In the chaos of occupation, the denunciation letters stopped, not because people had suddenly become better or more trustworthy, but because there was no longer a Gestapo to send them to, no longer a system that would reward betrayal with the destruction of your enemies. The machinery of terror had been dismantled, its leaders dead or fled or standing trial, its offices burned and ransacked, its files scattered across Berlin like confetti. The postman wondered what had happened to all those letters that had reached their destination, whether they were lost in the collapse or archived somewhere, whether future historians would sift through them and try to understand how a nation had turned itself into an army of informants. He wondered if any of the letter writers felt guilt for what they had done, or if they simply moved on, reinventing themselves as victims of the regime they had so eagerly served, claiming they had never believed, had only been following orders, had only been trying to survive. The city began the slow, painful process of reconstruction, both physical and moral, and part of that process was confronting what had happened, what people had done to each other during the 12 years of Nazi rule. The Allies conducted denazification tribunals, trying to separate the true believers from the opportunists, from the merely compliant, though the lines were often impossible to draw. The postman was questioned several times, routine interviews where occupation authorities wanted to know his party affiliation, his war record, his activities during the Reich. He told them he had been a postal worker, nothing more, that he had delivered mail and stayed out of politics, and they stamped his papers and moved on because there were millions of cases to process and limited time and resources. He never mentioned the letters he had burned, never claimed to be a hero or a resistance fighter, because that would have required proof he did not have, would have invited scrutiny he could not afford, and besides, the people he had saved did not know they had been saved, could not testify on his behalf even if he had wanted them to. He tried to return to normal life, or what passed for normal in a devastated city occupied by foreign armies, rationed by the victors, struggling to rebuild from rubble. He found work again in the postal service, which was being reorganized under Soviet supervision, and he walked routes through Berlin once more, delivering mail to addresses that had been renumbered and buildings that were often just foundations with addresses painted on makeshift signs. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine, but it was also haunted, because everywhere he walked, he remembered. He remembered the family that had lived in that building before the bombs came. He remembered the shop owner, who had disappeared one night and never returned. He remembered every letter he had burned and every letter he had failed to intercept, every small victory and every crushing failure of his private war against betrayal. Most of all, he carried the knowledge that his resistance had been invisible, that history would not record what he had done, that there would be no medal or recognition or even acknowledgement, because the nature of his heroism required secrecy, and the people he had saved did not know they owed him their lives. He would die someday, probably soon given the hardship and malnutrition and stress he had endured, and his story would die with him, buried in an unmarked grave of forgotten acts, in a war where millions had died and individual heroism was too small to measure against the scale of the catastrophe. But he also knew with a certainty that nothing could shake, that he had done the right thing, that in a world designed to make everyone complicit, he had refused, that he had fought back in the only way available to him, and that some people were alive because of choices he had made, in sorting rooms and alleys and basements. That knowledge would have to be enough, because it was all he would ever have, all that would remain when everything else had turned to dust. The postman's name has been lost to history, swallowed by the chaos of war and the deliberate silence of a man who never sought recognition for what he had done. We do not know when he died, whether he survived into old age in the divided Berlin, or whether the deprivations of the war years claimed him in the decades that followed. We do not know if he ever told anyone his story, if he confided in a friend or family member during a moment of weakness, or if he carried the secret to his grave as he had carried it through the war, locked away in the deepest part of himself, where even memory could not easily reach. What we do know from fragments of testimony and historical records pieced together decades later is that he existed, that he was real, that somewhere in the machinery of the Third Reich's postal system, at least one person chose resistance over compliance, chose humanity over survival, chose to burn the letters rather than deliver them to their deadly destination. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity and resistance, about what ordinary people can and should do when they find themselves inside a system designed for evil. The Nazi regime succeeded because millions of people made small choices every day to participate, to cooperate, to not ask questions, to prioritize their own safety over the suffering they enabled. The bureaucrats who processed the paperwork, the train conductors who drove the transports, the accountants who balanced the books, the postal workers who delivered the letters, all of them could have claimed they were just doing their jobs, just following orders, just trying to survive in dangerous times. And most of them did make that claim after the war, and many people accepted it, because the alternative was too overwhelming, the idea that an entire nation could be held accountable for complicity in genocide. But the Postman proved that another choice was possible, that even within the machine, even from a position of seeming powerlessness, resistance was achievable if someone was willing to accept the risk. The denunciation letters he burned represent only a tiny fraction of the millions that circulated through Nazi Germany, feeding the Gestapo's apparatus of terror and turning the entire population into potential informants. By some estimates, over 3 million denunciation letters were filed during the 12 years of Nazi rule, accusations that led to hundreds of thousands of arrests, tortures, executions, and deportations. The system worked because people participated, because neighbors were willing to destroy neighbors over petty disputes or ideological fervor or simple malice dressed up as patriotic duty. The Postman could not stop that system, could not even significantly slow it down, but he created cracks in the machinery, small spaces where humanity could survive, and he proved that the system was not as inevitable or as all-powerful as it wanted people to believe. Every letter he burned was evidence that the machine could be sabotaged, that the poison could be intercepted, that ordinary people had more agency than they admitted. His story also reminds us that most acts of resistance during the Holocaust and World War II were small, undocumented, and performed by people whose names we will never know. We remember the dramatic acts, the assassinations and the uprisings and the organized resistance movements, but we forget the countless small rebellions that happened in sorting rooms and kitchens and back alleys, the moments when someone chose to help rather than harm, to hide rather than expose, to destroy rather than deliver. These acts saved lives, not millions but hundreds, thousands perhaps, and each life saved was a universe preserved, a future that would not have existed if someone had not made the harder choice. The Postman is a symbol of all those unknown resistors, all those people who fought in silence and died in obscurity, whose heroism consisted not of grand gestures, but of daily decisions to remain human in inhuman circumstances. Today, when we face our own questions about complicity and resistance, about what to do when systems become corrupt or cruel, about whether individual actions matter against overwhelming institutional power, the story of the Postman offers both inspiration and challenge. He had every reason to comply, every excuse to look the other way, every justification for prioritizing his own survival. He lived in a totalitarian state that executed people for far less than what he was doing. He had no support network, no resistance cell to protect him, no guarantee that his actions would make any difference at all. He was just one man with matches and courage, and a decision that he made new every morning to keep fighting, even when the fight seemed pointless. And because he made that decision, because he struck those matches in dark places and burned those letters, some people lived who would have died. Some families stayed together who would have been destroyed. Some fragment of decency survived in a world designed to eliminate it. His legacy is not in monuments or history books, but in the lives that continued, in the children who were born because their grandparents survived, in the ripple effects of mercy extended when mercy was a capital crime. This is the story they never wanted you to know, the story of the postman who refused to deliver betrayal, and it matters now more than ever because the choice he faced, the choice between complicity and resistance, between convenience and conscience, between silence and action, is a choice that every generation must make for themselves. And the answer is never as simple as we want it to be.